The night Nora Calloway was escorted off the Hale property by 2 county deputies, the temperature had dropped to 31 degrees, and she had nowhere to go. Deputy Lynn Marsh stood at the end of the driveway with his hands in his coat pockets, not unkindly, watching her load the last cardboard box into the back of her 12-year-old hatchback. He did not help. Protocol, she supposed. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. You did not help someone you had just been called to remove. He was perhaps 40, broad-shouldered, with the particular stillness of someone who had been in enough situations that required him to be steady that it had become his natural state. He had arrived with a second deputy, a younger man who had stayed near the cruiser and looked at the ground when Nora carried boxes past him. She understood. This was not the kind of call anyone signed up for. Patricia Hale stood on the front porch of the house where Nora had lived for 6 of her 8 years of marriage, arms crossed, her breath making small clouds in the cold. Gerald Hale, Marcus's older brother, leaned in the doorway behind her wearing the expression Nora had spent years learning to absorb without letting it land. The expression said she had never belonged here. It said they had always known this day would come, and they were patient people, and the law, when you knew how to use it, was on the side of the patient. Nora carried the last box to the car with both hands and set it in carefully, because the box held the books Marcus had given her and the photograph and the few other things she had decided not to leave behind no matter what the legal situation suggested about what was technically hers. She did not slam the hatch. She had thought about slamming it, had rehearsed the sound of it in her head several times during the 40 minutes she had spent inside collecting winter clothes and legal documents, and the small framed photograph of her grandfather that she had kept on the nightstand since Marcus had placed it there, years ago, as a gesture she had not understood until after he was gone. She pressed the hatch shut with both hands until the latch caught, and then she walked around to the driver's side without looking back at the porch. She had come to get her things. They had called the police before she finished. Marcus Hale had died on the 23rd of April, 6 months and 4 days before the night Nora sat in her car at the end of that driveway, too cold to drive and too proud to let anyone see her deciding what to do next. He had been 44 years old. A heart attack, the coroner said, the kind that comes without warning and without the grace of a goodbye. He had gone to sleep beside her on a Thursday night and had not been there on Friday morning. That was the whole of it. 8 years together, and then he was simply gone, the way candles go when you are looking at something else. The marriage had been imperfect in the way that honest things tend to be. They had argued about money and distance and the particular cold front that the Hale family had always been willing to generate in Nora's direction. Patricia had made her position clear from the beginning. Nora was not from Millhaven. She had no family here, no history, no name the town associated with anything. She had come for a position at the county planning office when she was 29 years old and had stayed because of Marcus, and Patricia had never quite forgiven either of them for that. She was civil at holidays and at family dinners and at the public occasions where civility was required. In private, in small gestures, and in the particular way she declined to include Nora in conversations she was standing in the middle of, she made the territory clear. Gerald was less subtle about it. Gerald handled the Hale family's modest real estate holdings and had the manner of a man who confused legal standing with moral authority. He had retained an attorney within 2 weeks of Marcus's funeral. He claimed the house, which sat in Marcus's name alone, belonged to the estate and would be disposed of accordingly. He claimed the joint account, which held what Marcus and Nora had saved across 8 years of a shared life, was subject to review pending probate. He claimed, in the precise way of someone who has rehearsed the words with legal counsel, that Nora had no standing in Millhaven, that she never had, and that the most reasonable thing all of them could do was acknowledge that plainly and move on without unnecessary drama. Nora had stayed in the house for 4 months after the funeral, paying rent directly to Gerald at a rate he had set without asking her opinion. She had done this because the attorney she could barely afford had told her it was the safest position while the estate sorted itself. She had done it also because leaving felt like agreeing with something she could not bring herself to agree with. That her years with Marcus could be packed into cardboard and set outside. That the life they had built together had a market value Gerald could determine in an office without her present. 2 weeks ago, Gerald had given her 30 days to vacate. Her attorney told her, in the carefully neutral voice of someone delivering an outcome they personally found unjust, that she had no legal grounds to fight it. The house was not in her name. The lease she had signed acknowledged her as a tenant. Whatever Marcus had intended was beside the point, because the law dealt in documents and the documents said what Gerald said they said. She had found a studio apartment in Carver, the next town over, and paid the deposit with money she had taken from selling the last of what her own family had left her. The plan had been to move this weekend. She had come today only to collect what remained. Clothes she had left behind. The photograph of her grandfather. A box of books Marcus had given her over the years, which Gerald would have donated without opening. She had not expected the phone call to the police. Or rather, she had told herself she did not expect it, which was different from being surprised. Deputy Marsh had been respectful and careful with the situation in the way of someone who understood he had been called to settle a dispute that the law could technically adjudicate, but that decency could not. He had walked her to the vehicle. He had said he was sorry for how things had gone. He had said, in the particular phrasing of someone who could not say what they actually meant while in uniform, that sometimes the law and what was right were not the same thing, and that he hoped she had people she could call tonight. She had thanked him. She had meant it. Now she sat in the cold with the heat running and watched the porch light go off, and allowed herself to breathe slowly for a minute before she thought about next steps. The boxes in the back held everything she owned that had not already been moved. A winter coat, 2 pairs of boots, books she loved and would not give up, the photograph in its frame. She had come to Millhaven at 29 with 2 suitcases, and she was leaving at 38 with a hatchback half full of cardboard. And somehow that felt less like a statement about her than about the Hale family's particular understanding of what a person was worth. She drove east on Millhaven's main road without a destination decided. Past the closed diner and the hardware store and the gas station with the Christmas lights no one had taken down in years. Past the bank where she had closed the joint account 2 months ago, and the church where Marcus's funeral had been held, and the county planning office where she had worked until Gerald, through a set of connections she still did not fully understand, had made her position uncomfortable enough that resignation felt like the less costly option. She drove past all of it and let the town unspool behind her the way it did when you were not trying to see it, until the lights thinned and the road opened up and the town gave way to the flat winter fields that surrounded it. And then she pulled onto the shoulder because she needed to think, and she could not do that while moving. The fields were gray in the dark, the soil turned over and waiting for a season that had not arrived. The landscape here had always struck her as blunt, none of the softness of the countryside she had grown up in further south, just flat land and winter sky, and the occasional stand of trees that gave the impression of having been planted by someone who had wanted a windbreak, and not much more. She had learned to find a spare kind of beauty in it over the years, the way you learn the character of things that are not immediately welcoming. Marcus had grown up here and had loved it without reservation, the way you love what you were shaped by, and she had come to understand the place through that love, even when she could not share it entirely. Ahead, perhaps half a mile, she could see the outline of a structure against the sky. She recognized it before she could make out its shape clearly, recognized it the way you recognize a place you have driven past so many times it has become part of the background of a life. The Millhaven Depot. She had owned it for 16 years, though owned was a generous word for the relationship she had maintained with the building. Her grandfather, James Calloway, had left it to her when she was 22 and he was gone. He had been the last station master, the man who had kept the books and managed the incoming freight and locked the doors for the final time in the autumn of 1962 when the railroad stopped its runs through Millhaven and the town received the news the way small towns receive the closing of things, with a grief that had nowhere useful to go. The building had been his by then. The railroad had sold it to him at a price set deliberately low, the kind of transaction that passes for generosity when an institution cannot manage actual gratitude. James Calloway had signed the deed without ceremony and taken it home and put it in a drawer beside the stationmaster's keys he would never need again, and 26 years later he had died and left everything to his granddaughter. Nora had paid the property taxes every year since. That was the whole of her stewardship. She had visited the building twice, once in the weeks after the inheritance and once when she and Marcus had driven by and he had asked about it, and she had pulled over on an impulse. They had walked around the outside and looked through the dirty windows and Marcus had said it had good bones, which was what people said about structures they admired without wanting the responsibility of them. Nora had agreed and had thought about what she might do with the building someday, and had never gotten past the thought. The county assessor had valued the property at $4,800 in the most recent assessment. The building itself, they wrote, contributed minimal value. The land beneath it, in that part of Millhaven, was what held the number up, and even that was not a number anyone had fought over. The assessor who had come out to walk the property had told Nora, not unkindly, that if she ever wanted to sell, the land alone might attract a buyer looking for space, but the structure would likely need to come down first. The depot was not salvageable in any practical sense, he said. Nora had thanked him and had driven home and had filed the assessment with the tax paperwork she kept in a folder she rarely opened, and had not thought about the building again for nearly 3 years. She turned off the shoulder now and drove slowly down the unpaved road to the depot's old service entrance. The headlights lit weeds pushing through gravel and the rusted skeleton of a loading dock that had not received anything in 60 years. She parked beside the east wall and turned off the engine and sat for a moment in the quiet, listening to the engine cool, the familiar ticking of metal returning to its resting state. Then she got out, found the key in the bottom of her bag where she always kept it, the only key, as far as she knew, that existed for this lock, and went to the depot's side door. The lock resisted. Old locks do this when they are unaccustomed to being asked anything. She worked the key carefully, both hands, until the mechanism turned, and then she put her shoulder against the door and pushed. The door swung inward with the sound of something long sealed, making its first accommodation to a change. The smell came immediately. Dust and old wood and something underneath that was harder to name, a dry, faintly mineral quality that made her think, without knowing why, of her grandfather's garage on summer afternoons when she was a child. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. No electricity, no power of any kind connected to the building. But the windows were large, original depot glass set in heavy frames, and they faced southeast, and the moon was nearly full, and enough pale light came through the accumulated grime to show her the outlines of the space. She was in what had been the freight room, a long rectangular area that ran the building's east side. The floor was wide plank wood, old-growth boards that had barely moved in a century. Wooden shelving lined one wall, warped but upright. Metal brackets jutted from the plaster where equipment had been bolted and then removed. Along the far wall, a long wooden counter ran the width of the room, its surface cut and stained with 40 years of work. She put her bag on the counter and went back to the car for blankets and the flashlight she kept in the trunk. She set herself up in the corner farthest from the door, where a bench had been built into the wall, long enough to lie on with your knees slightly bent. She spread the blankets, pulled her coat closed, and lay down. She did not expect to sleep. She lay in the moonlit quiet and listened to the building settle around her. Old structures spoke in particular ways, low groans and occasional ticks, the sound of wood and metal adjusting slowly to the cold. The depot's voice was low and regular, not threatening. It was the sound of something that had been standing a long time and expected to keep standing. She thought about Marcus. She did this less now than she had in the first months, but nights in unfamiliar places had a way of returning him. She thought about the Thursday they had last gone to sleep beside each other, how unremarkable it had been, how she had turned off the lamp without knowing it would be the last time she reached for it while he was there. In the morning he was gone, and the world had reorganized itself around an absence she did not yet know how to carry, and she had spent 6 months learning the weight of it. She thought next about her grandfather. This was where loss usually took her, eventually, when she let it run long enough. James Calloway had been a quiet man, the particular quiet of someone who had decided long ago that most of what he needed was already in front of him. He had worked at the depot for 41 years, arriving before the first train and leaving after the last, keeping the freight books with a precision the railroad company had acknowledged in formal letters she had found in his papers after he died. He had been proud of the work without ever needing anyone to name it. She had loved him the way you love someone who is simply, reliably there, who never makes you doubt that they are glad you exist. He had died in the spring she was 22, in a hospital room that smelled of industrial soap and the particular stale air of places where time moves differently. And she had held his hand and told him she was going to be all right, and he had nodded in the way that meant he believed her, which was the only reason she had said it. He had left her the depot and a letter. The letter said several things she had kept with her over the years. One of them was, "Do not let anyone tell you a thing has no value simply because they cannot see what it is worth." She had read that as advice about life in general. She had been 22. She had not known it was instructions. She fell asleep, eventually, without deciding to. She woke to gray morning light coming through the southeast windows and long, pale bars that caught the dust she had disturbed the night before. For a moment, she did not know where she was. Then the smell of old wood and the firmness of the bench beneath her told her, and she lay still for a moment and let herself come the rest of the way awake. She was cold, but not as cold as she had feared. The building held its temperature better than she would have expected from a structure that had sat empty for decades. The walls were original, thick plaster over wood lath, and the floor sat tight, without drafts. She had slept in worse conditions, in a tent in the rain during one of the early camping trips she and Marcus had taken when they were still learning what kind of people they were together. She had been warmer in the depot than she had been in the tent, which said something about either the tent or the building that she noted and filed away. The morning was quiet in the way that buildings are quiet when they have been holding silence for a long time and have gotten good at it. She lay on the bench and looked at the ceiling, at the heavy timber beams crossing the space above her, and thought about her grandfather. He had been in this building every working day for 41 years. He had walked the length of the freight room and the waiting room thousands of times. He had sat at the counter and kept his books and answered the telephone when the railroad needed him to answer it, and had done all of this with the unhurried steadiness of a man who understood that work done well was its own argument for being done. She had not known, sitting beside him in the hospital at 22, that the building he had left her was anything other than the building. A place where he had worked. A structure that had outlasted its usefulness and sat empty at the edge of the town he had lived in all his life. She had not known because he had not told her, and she had not wondered because she had been 22 and grieving, and the things you do not think to ask are often the things that matter most. She thought about the letter. She had read it so many times in the years after he died that she had thought she understood it. She had thought the instruction about value and other people's blindness to it was the kind of thing a person of his generation said, because they had lived through enough to know it was true. She had not known he was speaking from specific experience. She had not known the letter was a map. She sat up and folded the blankets and stretched her back standing, and then looked at the freight room in the morning light that the night had not given her. The room was larger than it had felt in the dark. The ceiling was high, crossed with heavy timber beams that were sound, as far as she could tell, their grain dense and uncracked. The shelving units were sturdier than they had appeared the night before. The counter along the far wall was solid enough that she leaned against it without testing it first. She went to the car and retrieved the bag she had packed hastily the day before. Water, granola bars, clothes, a legal pad she carried from habit. She brought it inside and ate standing at the counter, the way you eat when circumstances have temporarily suspended the rituals of sitting down. Then she began to look at the building properly. The freight room connected through a wide archway to the main passenger waiting area. She walked through and stood in the center and turned slowly. The ceiling here was higher, with a row of narrow, clear-story windows near the top that let in light without view. The original benches were still bolted to the floor in two long rows, their wood worn smooth by the accumulated weight of decades of people waiting for trains. The ticket window was boarded from the inside. The main doors facing the old platform were chained with a padlock that had turned entirely orange. Beside the ticket window, a framed timetable hung on the wall, its paper inside turned to the color of old straw. Beside it were three other frames, empty. The hooks that had held whatever belonged in them were still there. She wondered, briefly, what had been removed and when. Whether someone had come in after the station closed and taken the things that seemed worth taking, not knowing, or not caring, what remained. She walked along the wall, running her fingers along the plaster. Original work, she thought, smooth and dense with a few long cracks near the ceiling where the building had settled over a century. The baseboards were oak, tight to the floor. Whoever built this had built it with the confidence of people who expected it to outlast them, which it had, comfortably. The Millhaven Depot had been built in 1887, according to the one article she had found in the County Historical Society's records when she had briefly looked into its history after inheriting it. built to serve the rail line that had connected the region to larger commerce, and to the wider world that commerce implied. For 75 years it had done exactly that. Then the line had been discontinued, and the depot had been shuttered, and James Calloway had been the last person to turn the key in its lock in any official capacity. After that it had been simply there, standing in the way that old buildings stood when they had been built well and no one had gotten around to taking them down yet. She stood in the middle of the waiting room and looked at the empty frames on the wall. 3 of them, evenly spaced, their hooks still holding. She had noticed them the night before in the moonlight and had thought about them while she was trying to fall asleep. Whatever had hung there was gone, removed at some point by someone who had decided it was worth removing. The timetable frame beside the ticket window still held its contents. The paper inside turned to the color of old straw. The print on it too faded to read from where she stood. She moved closer and looked at it. The dates on it were from 1961, a year before the station had closed. The times listed on it represented a world that had stopped existing before she was born. She turned away from the wall and walked back through the archway. The shelving units along the inner wall bore the marks of 40 years of active use. Scuff marks and stains, and the faint outlines where crates and heavy boxes had rested for years. Near the back wall, though, the shelving changed. The units there were heavier, built into the wall rather than standing free of it, their joinery more deliberate. The spacing between the shelves was irregular in one section, wider than standard freight would require, as if whoever built that portion had specific dimensions in mind rather than general utility. She almost moved on. There was no particular reason to stop, but her grandfather's presence was there in the room with her, not in any mystical sense, but in the specific way a person stays with you in places they shaped, in the tightness of the joinery and the levelness of the shelves, and the careful placement of things that had been placed carefully. She crouched and looked at the back of the lowest shelf, at the cleaner wood protected from decades of dust by the shelf above it. There was a seam, not the seam of boards joined flat, which was everywhere in the building. This seam ran vertically, from the floor to the full height of the shelf panel, and it was too precise and too complete to be a structural join. It was the edge of a door. She straightened slowly and looked at the panel. Then she tried to open it, pressing her fingers into the seam edge and pulling. The wood did not move. She pressed along its length, feeling for a latch or a mechanism, something built into the frame. Nothing visible. The panel was solid under her hands. No flex, no give. Whatever held it closed was not on this side of the wood. She stepped back and looked at the shelving unit as a whole. 8 feet wide, built floor to ceiling, her grandfather's careful hand in every joint. The door panel occupied the right third. She studied the remaining 2/3 now, looking for what she had missed. She found it on the underside of the third shelf from the top, set flush with the wood so that it disappeared unless you were looking directly at it from below. A small metal lever, no longer than her thumb. She stood there for a moment. She was aware that this was the kind of decision that divided kinds of experience. She could close this moment before it opened any further. She could walk to the car and drive into Carver and buy a cup of coffee and spend 3 days doing something sensible while the apartment became available. Any of those things was available to her. She reached up and pressed the lever. Nothing happened immediately. Then she heard it, from somewhere inside the wall, a soft mechanical release, something weighted and precise. The panel did not swing open. It moved inward about an inch, just enough to break whatever seal had held it, and a thin line of darkness appeared at its edge. The smell that came through that inch of opening was different from the rest of the building. Still old, still dry, but layered with something underneath that she recognized without being able to name it immediately. Then she had it. It was the smell of the back room at a small museum in Philadelphia that she and Marcus had been taken into during their first year together. A room that held things not currently on display. A room that smelled of controlled air and old materials and the particular stillness of objects that have been carefully kept. She put both hands on the panel edge and pulled it open. The space behind it was 4 feet deep in the width of the panel. The back wall of the space was not a wall. It was the top of a staircase, steep and narrow, with a rope handrail running along the right side and 14 wooden steps descending into darkness below. She shone the flashlight down into the space. The stairs were the same old-growth lumber as everything else in the building, dense and dark with age. At the bottom, 12 feet below, The beam struck a concrete floor and the edges of a large room beyond. She stood at the top of those stairs for a long time. Then she put her foot on the first step. The stairs did not creak. They were too dense for that, compressed by decades into something closer to stone than wood. She descended with one hand on the rope and the flashlight in the other, and with each step more of the room below came into the beam. And by the time she reached the bottom, she had stopped moving, because she needed a moment to understand what she was looking at. The room was roughly 30 feet square. The walls were poured concrete, smooth and gray, the workmanship even and careful. The ceiling was low, perhaps 7 feet, crossed with heavy exposed beams that supported the freight room floor above. A row of narrow shuttered windows ran along the south wall, near ceiling height, their exterior boards painted to match the depot's siding. She would not have noticed them from outside. She had not noticed them. That had been the intention. But what she was looking at was not the architecture. Along every wall, on shelving built with the same joinery she had come to recognize as her grandfather's, were objects. Dozens of them. She swept the flashlight slowly and counted shelving units, 6 along the north wall, 4 along the south, 2 flanking the staircase opening on the east. Every unit was full. Some objects were wrapped in cloth that had once been white and had turned to the color of old paper. Some were in wooden crates, their lids fitted carefully but not nailed. Some were in steel boxes with simple latches. Some were in cylindrical metal canisters, sealed. The wrapping was uniform throughout, the kind of uniformity that comes from one person doing things the same way every time across many years. In the center of the room, on a long wooden table that ran nearly the length of the space, sat a leather-bound ledger. It was open. She crossed to the table and looked at it. The leather was dried and stiff with age but intact, and the pages open before her were covered in handwriting she recognized before she could have explained how. Her grandfather's hand, the forward slant of his letters, the particular way he crossed his sevens. She turned the pages carefully. The earliest entries were dated 1947. The most recent were from 1986. Each entry followed the same format. A date, a description of an object, its condition, its origin as far as he could determine it, the circumstances of its arrival at the depot, his documentation of notification attempts, and a final column he had labeled simply EST value with a figure beside each entry. In the early years, the figures were modest. In the middle years they grew. By the later years, some of the individual entries held numbers that did not belong in a conversation about unclaimed freight at a rural railroad depot in a small town in the middle of the country. She turned pages. She read entries. She read them the way you read something when the words are clear, but the meaning keeps arriving in pieces, each piece larger than the previous, until you have to put your hand flat on the table to keep from losing your footing on what had seemed, until a moment ago, like solid ground. Her grandfather had spent 41 years at the Millhaven Depot. He had managed the incoming and outgoing freight with the precision the railroad company had commended in writing. He had also, during those 41 years, accumulated something of his own. Every item in this room had passed through the depot as freight. Every item had, according to the entries in the ledger, gone unclaimed past the railroad's holding period. Every item had been documented, the recipient notifications attempted, the waiting period observed, the disposition recorded. And then James Calloway had made a decision, each time, quietly and without ceremony, that the items would not be disposed of in the way the railroad intended. He had brought them here. He had built this room to hold them. He had wrapped them and shelved them and written them into his ledger with the same precision he brought to everything else. And he had done all of this across 4 decades without telling a single person, including her. Except in the letter. The letter she had read as general wisdom at 22 and kept, and eventually lost in the upheaval of 6 months of grief and legal paperwork and displacement. She turned to the last page with writing on it. Her grandfather's hand there was smaller and less certain than in earlier years, the hand of a man in his late 80s writing with care. For the one who finds this, it belongs to you. It always was meant to. I was only keeping it safe until you were ready for it. I hope you understand what it took. I hope you know what it is worth. Not just the money. All of it. Look carefully at everything before you let anyone else in. Nora stood with the ledger in her hands and her grandfather's words in front of her, and somewhere above her in the town that had called the police on her the night before, Gerald Hale was probably still awake and planning his next movement. She looked around the room. She looked for a long time. Then she went back to the nearest shelf and pulled the first cloth-wrapped piece she could reach. It was perhaps 18 inches by 24, roughly rectangular, and lighter than she expected. She unwrapped it slowly. The outer cloth was fragile at the edges, crumbling slightly where it had dried over decades. Beneath it was a second layer of material she recognized dimly, waxy and dense, a kind of conservation wrapping she had seen once in that museum backroom, the kind used for things that needed to be protected against moisture and light and time. She removed this layer carefully, peeling it back from one corner. The surface beneath was painted wood. Old, genuinely old. The colors muted in the way that age and protection together produce, vivid under the dust that had settled on the waxy layer, the kind of vivid that does not look like restoration. She could see part of a woman's face in three-quarter profile, the brushwork dense and deliberate and entirely unhurried, the kind of work she associated with paintings that stood behind roped barriers in buildings where you were not supposed to get too close. She wrapped it back exactly as she had found it and returned it to the shelf. She found the corresponding entry in the ledger. Her grandfather had written that the painting arrived at the depot in the late autumn of 1953, addressed to a private gallery in Cincinnati, shipped from an address in New York as general freight. The gallery had closed before the shipment arrived. He had documented the notification attempts, 4 of them across 12 months, each one undeliverable. At the end of the holding period, he had written simply, "Taken into care," and moved on to the next entry. She read for a long time. Paintings, small sculptures, rolled works in sealed canisters, bound portfolios, crates whose contents his entries described in precise and careful language. All of it freight. All of it unclaimed. All of it documented with the same thoroughness he had brought to the railroad's own books, because James Calloway had understood that if you were going to do something, the documentation was what separated a decision from a mistake. She read entries about paintings addressed to galleries that had closed without forwarding information. Sculptures shipped to private collectors whose estates had dissolved before delivery could be made. Portfolios of drawings consigned to dealers who had moved or died or simply stopped answering correspondence. Small bronzes from addresses in New York and Boston. Sealed canisters her grandfather had labeled with systematic precision. Wooden crates from a range of origins. And in 3 cases from addresses that were not American at all, objects that had crossed an ocean on their way to Millhaven and had found no one waiting on the other end. Her grandfather had waited for all of them. He had made his calls and written his letters and observed his holding periods, and had then made his decisions, one item at a time, across the span of 4 decades, with the patience of someone who understood that the correct way to do anything was also the only way worth doing it. What she could not reconcile yet was the scale. She had known him as a modest man, a man of careful habits and uncomplicated pleasures, a man who fixed his own screens and grew tomatoes and had never owned anything that needed more than one room to contain it. She had not known he was a man who had spent his entire working life quietly accumulating something that, when the columns in the ledger were summed, added up to this. The values in the ledger, even in the currency of 30 and 40 years ago, even accepting that his estimates had been made by a stationmaster and not a trained appraiser, added up to a number she wrote at the bottom of the first page of her legal pad, and then sat with for a long moment without moving. She went back up the stairs around noon. The cold air in the freight room felt sharp after the still air below. She closed the panel and heard the latch settle back into place. She pressed the wood until she was certain the seal was closed. Then she went and sat on one of the old benches in the waiting room, in the morning light coming through the clear-story windows, and she looked at the empty frames on the wall and thought about what her grandfather had said in the letter she no longer had. Do not let anyone tell you a thing has no value simply because they cannot see what it is worth. She understood it now. She did not let herself run ahead into what any of it meant. She had spent enough of the past 6 months hoping things that did not happen to have a clean relationship with optimism. She stayed with what she knew. She knew the room was real. She knew the objects in it were real. She knew her grandfather's ledger was real and his handwriting was real and his 40 years of careful, patient, private work were real in the most concrete sense available, which was that she had held the evidence of it in her hands. She knew she owned this building. Whatever was in it, and the building was hers, and the property taxes were current, and nobody had disputed any of that because nobody had ever found reason to look. She also knew that a room full of objects taken from unclaimed railroad freight, even under documented policy, occupied a complicated legal position. She did not know the specifics of that position, but she knew enough to understand that telling the wrong person at the wrong moment could produce outcomes she could not reverse. Her grandfather had written it plainly. Look carefully at everything before you let anyone else in. She went back to the car for a second granola bar and more water, and then she went back downstairs with the legal pad and spent 4 hours making her own list. She moved slowly along the shelves, not opening anything beyond what she had already touched, reading the ledger entry by entry and cross-referencing each one against the objects visible on the shelves. She made notes in her own handwriting, a parallel record, specific and detailed, the kind of record you keep when you understand that records are what protect you. By the time the afternoon light had started coming slant through the shuttered windows set high in the concrete walls, she had covered 32 pages of the legal pad. 78 items documented in the ledger, 64 visually confirmed, 14 to locate more carefully in the spaces she had not yet fully examined. She wrote the sum of the estimated values at the bottom of the last page and looked at it. Even in the currency of 30 to 40 years ago, even taken at her grandfather's own conservative estimates, which she suspected had been conservative because James Calloway had not been a man given to overstatement. Even without adjusting a single figure for what time had done to the value of things well kept, it was not a small number. It was not close to a small number. She sat on the concrete floor at the base of the stairs with the legal pad in her lap and understood something she had not understood until that moment, which was that her grandfather had not left her the depot for sentimental reasons. He had not left it because it connected him to his working life or because he thought the building itself deserved preservation. He had left it to her because it held something he had spent his entire life building, quietly and without acknowledgement, and he had trusted her specifically to know what to do with it. She did not yet know what to do with it, but she knew she needed to figure that out before she did anything else, because the thing she had found was large enough that a single mistake made in the wrong direction could disappear it entirely, and her grandfather had spent 40 years making sure it did not disappear. Against the south wall stood 4 wooden crates she had not gotten to yet. They were larger than the other storage, each one roughly 2 feet square and 3 feet long, built from the same careful hand as everything else in the room. Their lids were fitted and waxed at the seams. No labels on the sides, but corresponding entries in the ledger. She had read those entries twice already and had set them aside to return to, because the descriptions they contained were different in character from the others. More specific, more careful in their language. Her grandfather's hand in those entries was slightly more deliberate than in the surrounding pages. The way handwriting shifts when the writer knows what they are writing matters more than usual. She crossed to the south wall and stood in front of the first crate and put her hand flat on its lid. The wood was cool and dry under her palm. Dense, stable, the same quality as everything else in the room. Her grandfather had built with material that would last because he had understood, presumably from the very beginning, that what he was building needed to hold for a long time. He had not known how long, exactly. He had not known that he would die before telling her in person what he had spent his life making. But he had built for the possibility, and the room had held, and here she was. She had read her grandfather's entry for this crate twice already. She read it a third time from the ledger open on the table. His handwriting in that entry was slightly more deliberate than in the surrounding pages, each letter formed with a particular care that told her something even before she had parsed the words. He had known when he was writing that entry that what he was recording was different in degree, if not in kind, from the items around it. She set the ledger down carefully. She found the edge of the lid where the wax seal had been applied and had dried to a single clean line she could follow with her thumbnail. She worked her thumbnail along the seam until she felt the wax give a dry, fine crumbling, and then she lifted the lid at the near edge with both hands and set it aside. Inside, packed in the same waxy conservation material she had found on the painting and on the other wrapped pieces, was a shape that did not resolve immediately into anything she could name. It was larger than a book and smaller than a painting and entirely regular in its dimensions, the regularity of something made precisely and packed to match its own shape. She reached in with both hands, taking it at its edges the way she had watched restorers handle things in the one documentary she could remember seeing about museum conservation, and lifted it clear of the crate and set it on the table. She unwrapped it the way her grandfather had wrapped everything, which was the way you handled something you understood was worth your patience. What was underneath the wrapping was not a painting. She stood very still and looked at it. She looked at it for a long time without touching it, the way you stand in front of something that is not yet finished telling you what it is. She had no expertise in what she was looking at. She could not have provided a confident name for it, or a history, or an appraisal, or any of the other forms of knowledge that would become necessary soon. But she had spent 8 years visiting museums and galleries with a man who had loved them, and she had walked through enough rooms of old things to know, with a certainty that was less about expertise than about some instinct she had apparently developed without knowing it, that what she was looking at was very old and was not the kind of thing that typically sat in a wooden crate in a concrete room beneath a derelict railroad depot in a town of 6,000 people. She looked up from the table and around the room, at the shelves, at the other crates, at the canisters she had not opened, at the 3 remaining crates she had not yet touched. She looked at all of it, in the beam of her flashlight standing in the room her grandfather had built and sealed and trusted her to find. She understood, in a way she had not let herself understand until this moment, that she was not looking at the remnants of a quiet man's private habit. She was standing in the middle of something her grandfather had spent 41 years building with intention and care and the particular moral seriousness of someone who believed that beautiful things deserved better than to be lost. He had not told anyone because he had understood, better than she did yet, that the world would make it difficult to protect something if the world knew you had it. He had told her, in the only way available to him, given what he had known and what he could not have known, he had told her everything she needed to find this room, and then he had trusted her to understand what to do with it. She placed the object back into the crate with the same care she had used to remove it, and replaced the lid and pressed it down until the wax seal caught. Then she went back to the ledger and turned to the entry that corresponded to what she had just seen, and she sat down on the concrete floor with the ledger in her lap and read what her grandfather had written. And then she sat there for a while with nothing but the beam of the flashlight and the quiet of the sealed room and the weight of 32 pages of her own notes pressing against her leg. She thought about Patricia Hale's face on the porch. She thought about Gerald and his attorney and the lease she had signed that said tenant rather than spouse. She thought about Deputy Marsh's careful words and the sound of her hatch closing in the cold. She thought about the studio apartment in Carver that would be available in 3 days, and about the deposit she had paid with the last of what her own family had left her. She thought about the letter she had lost in the upheaval of 6 months of grief and legal paperwork. The letter that she now understood had not been wisdom about life in general, but a specific and precise set of instructions from a man who had spent his entire working life making sure she would have what she needed to follow them. Look carefully at everything before you let anyone else in. She was not finished looking. There were 3 more crates against the south wall. There were 14 items in the ledger she had not yet located on the shelves. There was an entire section of the room she had not yet examined in the detail it deserved. And there was the number written at the bottom of the first page of her legal pad, which she had not let herself look at directly since she had written it, because looking at it directly required a kind of steadiness she was still assembling. She stood up. She picked up the flashlight and turned to face the rest of the room. She was not done yet. And for the first time in 6 months, that felt like a reason to keep going rather than a reason to be tired. She stood in the underground room with the open crate before her and her grandfather's ledger on the table and understood, for the first time since the night she had driven away from the Hale property with 2 deputies watching her go, that she was not going to be all right in the way she had been telling herself she was going to be all right. She was going to be something else. Something she did not yet have a name for. Because the language for what you become when the ground beneath a derelict building in a town that has been patient enough to wait you out opens and gives you this had not yet assembled itself in her mind. She set the lid of the first crate aside and looked at what was inside it. Her grandfather's entry for this crate was the most deliberate in the ledger. She had noticed that when she first read it, the handwriting slightly larger and more carefully formed than his usual entries, as if he had wanted to make sure the record was beyond dispute. He had written the date of arrival, November 1961. The shipper's address, a forwarding company in Baltimore. The consignee, a private collector in Chicago whose name appeared once and was then crossed out, replaced in smaller script with the notation estate dissolved, executor unreachable. He had written his description of the contents with the precision she had come to expect, and he had written his estimated value in the column on the right in numbers that, even in 1961 dollars, were not the kind of numbers associated with ordinary freight. What she was looking at, nested in the conservation wrapping her grandfather had applied sometime in the 1960s and maintained, apparently, through the decades that followed, was a collection of currency. Not paper bills in the ordinary sense. These were banknotes from an earlier era, mint-condition specimens from series and institutions that no longer existed, organized in protective sleeves that her grandfather had sourced from somewhere and that had done their job. She could see the top layer clearly. Large format notes from the mid-1800s, the kind she had seen in photographs and history books, the kind that serious collectors spent serious money to acquire. Each one was separated from the next by a sheet of archival material. Each sleeve was labeled in her grandfather's hand with a number that corresponded to the ledger. She did not touch them. She looked for a moment and then replaced the lid and pressed it down. She moved to the second crate. Her grandfather's entry for this one was shorter, the handwriting from a later period, the mid-1970s based on the date. His description was precise and, she noticed, followed a different structure from the entries around it. Where most entries listed the item, the origin, the failed notification attempts, and the estimated value, this one included an additional notation she had not seen before. He had written, in smaller script beneath the standard entry, "I have confirmed this piece is listed in the registry of the insured loss. The insurance was paid. This presents a complication I have not yet resolved." 2 years later, in the same ledger, in slightly different ink that suggested a different pen, a different day, the complication resolves in favor of preservation. I have no other answer that satisfies. She had read that twice the first time through the ledger and had moved on because she had not yet fully understood what she was reading. She understood it now. Her grandfather had found, in among the ordinary unclaimed freight of a small-town depot, an item that had been declared a loss, that someone else had been paid for, that the world believed destroyed. And he had made a decision about it that he had struggled with for 2 years before arriving at the only answer he could live with. She opened the second crate. Inside, padded on all sides with material that had kept its integrity across 5 decades, was a bronze sculpture roughly the size of a large book, its surface dark with the particular patina that age and proper storage produce. She lifted it carefully with both hands. It was heavier than she expected, the density of old bronze in her palms, warm despite the cool of the room. The form was a figure, abstract but unmistakably human in its proportions, rendered with the kind of simplicity that is not simple at all, but is the result of stripping away every choice that does not serve the work. She did not know enough to identify it with certainty, but she had seen enough, in years of museum visits and gallery walks, to know the character of the work she was holding. She had seen this character in institutions, behind glass, beside placards that described price in the past tense and importance in the present. The weight of the bronze in her hands was the weight of something that belonged in a building with controlled humidity and security staff and an acquisitions committee that had debated its purchase over multiple meetings. She put it back with both hands and replaced the lid. Third crate. Her grandfather's entry here was from 1968. The notation was methodical, the handwriting relaxed, the handwriting of a man who had made his peace with the decisions he was making by then and was simply recording them faithfully. A collection of architectural drawings, original studies by a hand he had identified through research he had documented in a separate notation attached to the entry, with a small paper clip that had rusted to the page and was still there. She read the separate notation. He had spent 6 months tracking the provenance of the drawings through correspondence with 2 university libraries, and he had arrived, apparently with some confidence, at an attribution that put the drawings in a category that made the estimated value in the right-hand column make sense. She opened the third crate and found the drawings rolled in archival tubes, each tube labeled, each one sealed at both ends with a fitted cap her grandfather had fashioned from some material she did not recognize. She did not open the tubes. She looked at the labels and compared them to the ledger and confirmed that what was there was what the ledger said was there, and then she closed the crate. She stood in the center of the room for a moment. Then she went to the fourth crate. She had been saving it. She had read the entry for the fourth crate early in the morning and had returned to it 3 times before setting it aside to work through the other items first. The entry was from 1971, and it was the longest single entry in the ledger by a considerable margin. Her grandfather had written 4 full pages in a hand that was careful and unhurried, and entirely without the defensiveness she might have expected from someone documenting something he was unsure of. He had written as if he were explaining something to someone who needed the full account, which she supposed was exactly what he was doing. A consignment had arrived at the depot in late October of 1971. 11 items, shipped from a forwarding address in New York that traced back, her grandfather had written, to a dealer handling a European estate. The consignee was a private buyer in Kansas City. The buyer had died in September of 1971, 1 month before the consignment arrived. The estate attorney had been contacted by the depot, by the forwarding company, and by the railroad's claims department over a period of 14 months. The estate was in dispute. The attorney had eventually stopped responding. The forwarding company had closed. The railroad had authorized disposition. Her grandfather had opened the consignment to identify and document the contents, as was standard procedure for abandoned freight. He had found 11 paintings, small to medium format, rolled and protected with the same degree of care the depot now applied to them in the room below. He had spent the following 3 years researching them through library resources and correspondence, being careful, he noted, to phrase his inquiries as academic interest rather than as inquiries about specific items. He had arrived at attributions he described as highly probable for 7 of the 11, uncertain for 3, and unknown for 1. The highly probable attributions were in the right-hand column beside estimates that were so far beyond everything else in the ledger that they occupied a different order of magnitude. She had read all of this, twice, before she had come down this morning. She had read it and had understood intellectually what it described. Now she stood in front of the 4th crate and put her hands on the lid and understood it differently, the way you understand something when the thing itself is in the room with you. She opened the lid. Inside, 11 tubes, each one sealed and labeled in her grandfather's hand. 11 rolled paintings that had been in this room for 53 years, that had arrived at the Millhaven Depot as a consignment nobody came to collect, that a quiet man with good eyes and a habit of careful research had decided to protect rather than let disappear into the disposal process that the railroad's procedure had authorized. She looked at the tubes for a long time without touching them. Then she put the lid back. She was not going to open those tubes. Not here. Not without the right hands and the right conditions and the right documentation established first. Her grandfather had not opened them either, she noted. His entry said he had unrolled each one to the degree necessary to make his observations and had immediately re-rolled and resealed them. He had understood that handling matters. She climbed the stairs. In the freight room, she closed the panel and pressed the wood until the latch caught. She stood for a moment with her hand on the shelf, on the surface that concealed it, and let herself breathe. She was 38 years old. She had been escorted off a property she had called home for 6 years by a deputy who was sorry about it. She had spent 2 nights in a building the county had assessed at less than $5,000. She had 32 pages of handwritten notes in her legal pad and a number written at the bottom of the last page that she still had not looked at directly. She needed to think carefully. She needed to think more carefully than she had thought about anything in a long time, which meant she needed to stop for a moment and not think at all and let her mind settle before she made any decisions. She went to the waiting room and sat on the bench and watched the morning light move across the floor. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She sat there for perhaps an hour. She did not check her phone. She did not open the legal pad. She let the building be quiet around her, and she let herself be quiet inside it. And when she was done with that, she stood up and went to the car and drove toward town. She did not drive into Millhaven. She drove past the turnoff for it and continued on the county road to the interstate and took the interstate west to Carver, where she knew a diner that opened early and had reliable Wi-Fi and where nobody knew her face. She ordered coffee and eggs and sat in a back booth and opened her phone. She started with unclaimed freight law. It was, as she had suspected, complicated. The specifics varied by state and by era and by the particular circumstances of each case, and what had applied in the 1940s was not identical to what applied in the 1960s or the 1980s. but the broad structure was consistent enough for her to understand the shape of what her grandfather had done. Railroad carriers had operated under federal jurisdiction. Unclaimed freight, after a holding period that varied by regulation and type of goods, could be sold, donated, or disposed of at the carrier's discretion. The carrier's employee who handled that disposition had a defined role and a defined process, and the records of that process were the carrier's records and therefore the carrier's property. Her grandfather had been the stationmaster. He had been the person whose role it was to manage unclaimed freight at the Millhaven depot. He had documented everything: the notifications, the waiting periods, the failed attempts at contact. He had followed the process as it was defined. And then, where the process authorized disposal, he had exercised a form of discretion that the process did not explicitly authorize, but that, as far as she could determine from 2 hours of careful reading, it also did not explicitly prohibit in the language available to her. She ordered more coffee and kept reading. The clearest legal principle she could find that applied to the situation was the one that concerned the passing of time. 60 years was a long time. The railroad company that had owned the Millhaven depot had been absorbed into a larger carrier in 1974, which had itself been restructured twice since then. The records that would have documented specific freight transactions from the 1950s through the early 1980s would have been subject to whatever records retention policy each successive company had applied, and she suspected, based on what she knew about how organizations handled the records of absorbed predecessors, that the specific freight manifests from a small rural depot in that period were not something anyone had preserved with care. The items in the room had not been reported stolen. They had been reported lost, or in some cases not reported at all. They had arrived at a depot and failed to be collected. Her grandfather had documented everything he could and had kept what he had found. She was not going to determine the legal standing of any of this from a diner booth with a phone in 2 hours and no legal training. She knew that. What she was doing was building enough of a framework to understand what questions to ask when she found the right person to ask them. She needed an attorney. Not the attorney she had used for the estate matters, who had been competent, but who was local and whose network was local and who would have no particular expertise in what she was dealing with. She needed someone who understood art law and estate law and the intersection of those things, and who was far enough from Millhaven to have no connection to the Hale family or to anything Gerald might reach. She thought about who she knew. Her network had contracted significantly over the past 6 months, through no particular fault of anyone but the circumstances. The friends she had made through the county planning office were still warm toward her, but were also, most of them, still working there, and she did not want to pull anyone into something that could affect their employment. The friends she had from before Millhaven, from the years before Marcus, were mostly scattered and mostly out of touch in the way that people become when life takes them in different directions. She thought about a woman named Catherine Foss, who had been a colleague at a planning conference she had attended 3 years ago. Catherine was a land-use attorney based in Portland, and they had stayed in occasional contact, the kind of contact that is more than social media follows, but less than actual friendship. She was smart, and she did not know Gerald Hale, and she was far enough away that her involvement would not carry the particular risks that local involvement would. Nora sat with her phone and thought about whether this was a call she was ready to make. She thought about the 4th crate, about 11 tubes sealed in her grandfather's careful hand, about the entry in the ledger that ran to 4 pages and had been written with the deliberateness of someone who understood they were writing for a future reader whose stakes in the document would be significant. She called Catherine Foss. The call went to voicemail. She left a message that was careful in the way she had learned to be careful over the past 6 months, saying only that she had come across a situation involving property she owned that had some unusual legal dimensions, and that she would appreciate a call when Catherine had a few minutes. She left her number. She did not say anything else. She paid for the coffee and the eggs and drove back toward Millhaven on the county road, watching the fields on either side of her come slowly back into focus in the pale winter light. She was 3 miles from the depot's service road when she saw the truck. It was parked on the shoulder perhaps half a mile ahead, facing her direction, and she recognized it before she was close enough to read the plate. Gerald Hale drove a late-model pickup with a specific modification to the bed that she had always found ostentatious, a chrome rail system he used for nothing because he did not haul anything in the bed, which he had kept immaculate for 3 years. She recognized the chrome from 300 yards in the flat winter light. She slowed without quite stopping, pulled slightly to the right, and watched him in her peripheral vision as she drove past. He was in the driver's seat. His phone was to his ear. He was looking at the road ahead and did not turn as she passed. She drove past without any change in speed. In her rearview mirror, she watched the truck. It did not pull out. It sat on the shoulder. She kept driving until she reached the junction and turned left, away from the depot's service road, and drove another quarter-mile before pulling onto a farm road that ran behind a tree line and gave her a view of the junction. She sat and watched for 12 minutes. Then Gerald's truck came through the junction and turned right, onto the service road toward the depot. She felt her jaw tighten. She sat for another 5 minutes, watching the junction, watching the road. No other vehicles came through. She drove back to the junction and turned right and followed him at enough distance that he could not see her car easily behind him. She pulled off before the service road and parked behind a stand of winter bare trees and got out and walked the rest of the way on foot, keeping to the field edge rather than the road. The ground was hard and cold, and the dead grass crunched under her boots. She moved carefully, using the tree line for cover where she could. When she came around the building's east corner, she stopped. Gerald's truck was parked beside the depot, perhaps 20 feet from where she had been parking her own car. Gerald was not in the truck. She looked around the building's exterior and found him at the main door, the old platform-facing doors that had been chained for decades, peering through the gap between them with his hand cupped around his face to block the glare. She watched him. He moved away from the main doors and walked along the building's south face, looking up at the structure, his hands in his coat pockets. He stopped at each window and looked in. He pulled out his phone and appeared to take photographs of the exterior. She stood at the east corner and watched him for several minutes. He was doing what she recognized from the planning office as a property assessment walk, the kind of informal inspection you did when you were deciding what a piece of property was worth. He was not here because he knew about the room. He was here because he had learned, through someone, that she had been on the property, and he wanted to know why. He came around to the east side, and she stepped back around the corner and held very still. She heard his footsteps on the gravel, the sound of him trying the side door. The door was locked. She heard him rattle the handle once and then stop. Then the sound of him moving away, back toward the truck. She waited until she heard the truck's engine turn over, and then she waited another 2 minutes after the sound of the engine faded, and then she walked to the side door and went inside. She stood in the freight room and breathed. Gerald had not gotten in. The lock had held. He had found nothing, had seen nothing through the dirty windows, had photographed an exterior that told him only that the building was old and deteriorating and probably not worth significant investment. That was all he knew. That was all anyone who did not have the key would be able to determine from the outside. But his presence here changed things. It told her that someone had noticed her car on the service road. It told her that Gerald was watching, not obsessively, but consistently, the way a man watches something he has decided belongs in his accounting. He would be back. He might bring the attorney. He might start asking questions about the property's legal status that could become complicated if she had not established her own position clearly by then. She had less time than she had thought. Her phone rang at 2 in the afternoon. She was in the waiting room with the legal pad on her knee, adding to her notes, when Catherine Foss called back. Nora answered immediately. Catherine's voice was warm and professional in the specific way of someone who was good at her work and knew it. She asked Nora how she was, in the brief, genuine way rather than the extended social way, and Nora told her she was dealing with a few things, which was an understatement that she suspected Catherine, who was perceptive, recognized as such. "I have a property situation I would like your thoughts on," Nora said. "It involves a building I own. I inherited it from my grandfather. There are some questions about the legal standing of items that were stored in it prior to my ownership. Old items. The kind of questions I think require someone with a specific kind of expertise." There was a brief pause. "What kind of items?" Catherine asked. Nora thought for a moment about how to say this correctly. "Art," she said, "and some other things. Collected over a long period. Documented carefully, but with a history that needs to be examined by someone who understands how these things work." Another pause, longer this time. "Art law isn't my specialty," Catherine said slowly, "but I know people who do it well. Can you give me more detail?" "I would rather do that in person," Nora said. "I think the details matter in ways that are hard to convey without showing you the documentation." "Where are you?" "Millhaven." Eastern Oregon. I can be there Thursday, Catherine said. If what you're describing is what I think it might be, this is not a conversation to have over the phone. Thursday was 2 days away. Nora thought about Gerald's truck on the shoulder, about the photographs of the exterior, about the attorney Gerald kept on retainer. Thursday was tighter than she would have liked, but Catherine was available and willing, and she was the right person to start with. That works, Nora said. I'll send you the address. After she ended the call, she sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. 2 days. She needed to spend those 2 days preparing. She needed the documentation to be as clear and complete as possible before Catherine arrived, because the meeting they were going to have would determine the shape of everything that came after it. And she intended to walk into it as prepared as her grandfather had been when he wrote 4 pages about 11 tubes in a crate that he had kept sealed for 13 years before his death. She went back downstairs. She spent the remainder of the afternoon working through the 14 items she had not yet located on the shelves. 12 of them turned out to be tucked into spaces she had not examined carefully on her first pass, their ledger entries corresponding to positions she had misread in the flashlight. 2 she found in a separate section near the staircase that her grandfather had apparently added to the shelving at a later date, the joinery slightly different, the lumber from a different period. By the time she finished, the full inventory she could visually confirm stood at 76 items. 2 items in the ledger she could not account for, which she noted and set aside without speculation. She sat at the table with the ledger open before her and her legal pad beside it, and went through the columns her grandfather had filled in for each entry. The estimated values, dated as they were, ranged from figures that were modest by any measure to figures that required her to read the number twice, and then look again at the date beside it to remember that what had seemed large in 1971 did not translate directly to the present. She wrote a conservative calculation in the margin of her notes. She used the most recent date available for each estimate, adjusted upward by a factor she had derived from a general research article about art appreciation rates that she had read on her phone. She was not an appraiser. She was not an expert. She knew her methodology was approximate, and that the actual process of establishing values would require people whose expertise she did not possess. Even so, even applying her rough and inexpert calculation to the most conservative figures her grandfather had written, the number at the bottom of her page was not a number she had ever been in a room with before. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about the studio apartment in Carver that she had paid a deposit for with the last money she had. She thought about the assessment form that said $4,800. She thought about Gerald's attorney and the lease that said tenant. She turned to the back of the ledger. She had not done this on her first pass. She had worked from the front, through the entries, and had not thought to check whether anything was kept at the back. The back cover of the ledger was stiffer than the front, less handled, and when she opened it, she found a pocket made from a piece of cardstock her grandfather had folded and glued to the inside of the back cover. Inside the pocket were letters. There were 9 of them, folded to fit the pocket, written on different paper stocks, in different inks, at different times. They were not her grandfather's handwriting. They were the handwriting of someone else, someone whose script was cramped and rightward-leaning, and who wrote with a fountain pen whose nib had varied over the years the correspondence continued. She unfolded them carefully, in order of date, and began to read. The first was from 1979. It was brief, almost brusque. It acknowledged receipt of James Calloway's letter, which had apparently contained a description of some of what was in the room. It said, "Your concern for the condition of the items is understandable and your precautions seem appropriate. I would advise continuing as you have been. We should not be in written contact about specifics." The signature was a first name only, Alec. The second was from 1981. It was longer. It discussed, in careful and somewhat oblique language, the question of what the right thing to do was with items that had passed through legitimate channels into private keeping through a combination of regulatory procedure and individual discretion. It noted that the climate around questions of provenance had shifted in the past decade and was likely to shift further. It said, "What you have done cannot be easily characterized, and I say that as someone who has examined these questions from many angles. Your documentation is your strongest protection. Continue documenting." The 3rd through 7th letters were shorter, more widely spaced. and dealt in increasingly indirect language with what she came to understand was an ongoing correspondence about the room and its contents and the legal and moral questions surrounding them. The writer named Alec had opinions she found thoughtful. He was clearly someone with expertise in the relevant areas. He was also clearly someone who had decided that his involvement should remain strictly informal, strictly private, strictly off any record that could be examined. The eighth letter was from 1987 and was the longest of the group. It was also the most direct. It said, in part, "I have done as much research as I am able to do from a distance, and with the discretion this requires. My view is that what you have is legally complicated, but not necessarily legally indefensible. The key factors in any future determination will be the quality of your documentation, the specific provenance of each item, and the question of whether any item is the subject of an active claim or a registration of loss that has not been resolved by insurance settlement. The last point is the one that concerns me most. I would recommend a careful review of this question before any step is taken to disclose or transfer." She read this letter twice. Then she read the ninth letter. It was from 1988. It was short. It said, "Do not contact me again about this matter. My situation has changed, and I am not in a position to continue this correspondence. If what you have described exists and is where you say it is, it should remain there until someone with clear legal standing can establish a claim to it through proper channels. The climate is not favorable, and I cannot be involved further. I hope you understand. The world is not simple about these things, and neither am I." The letter was unsigned. Nora sat at the table in the underground room with the 9 letters spread in front of her and the flashlight casting its steady beam across her grandfather's carefully kept room and thought about what she had just read. Someone had known. Not about everything, perhaps, and not with the precision that her grandfather's own documentation provided. But someone with expertise, someone named Alec, had been in correspondence with her grandfather about the room and its contents for nearly a decade. Someone who had decided, in 1988, that the climate was not favorable and that he could not be involved further. Her grandfather had died in 1988. That was not a coincidence she was willing to dismiss. She looked at the letters again, at the handwriting, at the paper stocks, and the ink. The writer had been careful. There was no return address on any of them, no identifying institution, no last name. She had only the handwriting and the content and the date of the last letter, which was 6 months before her grandfather died. She did not know what the unfavorable climate of 1988 had been. She did not know who Alec was, or what situation had changed, or why the correspondence had ended with such finality. She knew only that she had found 9 letters tucked into the back of a ledger in a sealed room beneath a building that everyone in Millhaven agreed was worth almost nothing, and that the letters suggested her grandfather had not been entirely alone in knowing what the room held. She also knew, reading the letters in sequence, that Alec had not been a passive correspondent. He had been thinking about the same questions her grandfather had been thinking about: the legal standing of what the room held, the moral weight of the decisions her grandfather had made, the question of when and how and to whom the contents might eventually be disclosed. These were not casual observations. They were the observations of someone who had been turning these questions over carefully, probably for years before the first letter was written in 1979. Someone who had perhaps been consulted informally by her grandfather even earlier, in conversations that left no paper record, and whose written correspondence had started only when both men had decided that some of what they were thinking needed to be in a form that could be passed on. She thought about what it meant that her grandfather had kept those letters at all. He had been a careful man. He had understood that the letters represented a risk, a paper connection between himself and someone else who knew, or knew approximately, what the room contained. He had kept them anyway, tucked into the back of the ledger where they would be found by whoever found the room, which meant he had wanted them to be found. He had wanted whoever came after him to know that the questions were not new, that someone with expertise had considered them, that the legal complications had been known and thought about, and had led someone careful to the conclusion that the contents should remain where they were until someone with clear legal standing could establish a claim through proper channels. That someone was her. She was certain of that now in a way she had not been certain of anything for 6 months. She gathered the letters carefully and placed them back in the pocket her grandfather had made for them and closed the back cover of the ledger. She climbed the stairs for the last time that night. In the freight room, she sealed the panel and stood in the quiet. Outside, through the old glass of the high windows, she could see the last of the afternoon light going gray. She had been in the depot for nearly 2 full days. She had not eaten properly. She had slept on a wooden bench and worked by flashlight and made 32 pages of notes and found 9 letters in a pocket at the back of her grandfather's ledger. She had opened 4 crates and seen things she did not yet have the expertise to fully evaluate and had put them back exactly as she had found them. She was not panicking. She had been through 6 months of things that would have excused panic, and she had not panicked through any of them, and she was not going to start now. She was going to be as steady as her grandfather had been, who had spent 4 decades making decisions about difficult things without any obvious anxiety about it, whose ledger entries were written in handwriting that did not waver. She was going to get through tonight and tomorrow, and she was going to meet Catherine Foss on Thursday with documentation clean enough to start a conversation that she could control. She drove to the gas station at the edge of Millhaven and bought food she could take back to the depot without needing to heat it, and a bottle of water, and she paid cash. She drove back to the service road and parked and went inside and ate in the waiting room in the dark with her phone screen turned low and thought about what she knew and what she still needed to know. She also thought about Gerald and the photographs he had taken of the exterior. He would bring those back to his attorney, and the attorney would tell him what anyone looking at those photographs would conclude, which was that the building was old and damaged and probably not worth the cost of bringing up to any standard. That was the right answer, or had been the right answer until 2 days ago, and she intended for it to remain the visible answer for as long as she needed it to. The question of what Gerald was actually entitled to claim in relation to the depot had a clear answer. Nothing. The building was in her name. The property taxes were current. The deed was clean. Her grandfather had transferred it to her through a will that had been probated without dispute, because there had been no reason to dispute it. Gerald Hale had no standing in relation to this particular piece of property, and his attorney, if Gerald eventually paid one to look into it, would tell him that. The question of what Gerald might decide to do despite lacking standing was a different question, and she had 6 months of experience with the gap between what people were entitled to do and what they decided to do anyway. What she knew. Her grandfather had spent 41 years accumulating something he believed was worth protecting. He had documented everything. He had corresponded with someone who had expertise in the relevant questions and who had eventually decided the risk was too great to continue. He had died in 1988 and had left the building to her with a letter she had understood too simply and too late. What she needed to know? Who Alec was. Whether any of the items in the room were the subject of active claims that had not been resolved. Whether the 9 letters represented a risk or merely a complication. And whether Gerald Hale, who had been photographing the exterior of the building with the particular attention of a man building a case, was going to become a problem before Thursday. She lay down on the bench and pulled the blankets around her and looked at the ceiling and thought about all of this in the methodical way her grandfather had apparently thought about everything he dealt with, which was to take each question one at a time and not let the size of the whole prevent you from making progress on the part that was in front of you. The part that was in front of her was Thursday. Catherine Foss. The documentation she needed to prepare. She closed her eyes. She slept badly and woke before dawn and lay still in the cold of the freight room and listened to the building's sounds and thought about the 4 pages her grandfather had written about the 4th crate. He had written them in 1971, when he was in his mid-50s, old enough to understand the weight of what he was doing and young enough to believe he would eventually find the right answer for it. He had written with the confidence of someone who had decided that the preservation of the thing was the right answer, even if the right answer to what came after the preservation was still unclear. She thought about that. About making a decision that you knew was only the first of several decisions, and making it anyway because it was the decision that was in front of you and the others were not available yet. He had built this room. He had filled it. He had kept it. He had written to someone named Alec. He had died in 1988 with the letters tucked into the back of the ledger and the ledger left on the table as if he had stepped away for a moment and would be right back. And then he had left it to her. She sat up. She folded the blankets. She put her boots on and stood and stretched and went to the car and drove toward Carver again for coffee and something to eat, and another hour with her phone and the questions she had not finished answering yesterday. The research she did that morning was different in character from the day before. She was not looking for general principles anymore. She was looking for specific information. She searched for the history of unclaimed freight records from railroad carriers that had been absorbed into larger systems in the 1970s. She found, after an hour, a reference to a federal archive that held records from certain discontinued lines, records that had been transferred to government custody during one of the restructuring periods of the 1970s. The archive was not digitized. Access required a written request. She wrote the request on her phone and emailed it to the address provided, knowing it would take weeks and that she might be months from receiving anything useful. She did it anyway because her grandfather had taught her, without meaning to, that documentation was what protected you, which meant that documentation was also what you accumulated even when you did not yet know exactly what it was protecting you against. She searched next for the name Alec in connection with art law and railroad history and provenance research from the 1970s and 1980s. She found nothing specific. It was not a sufficient name. It was a first name from letters with no return address, and the world was not small enough for that to produce a useful result without more to work with. She closed the search and sat with her coffee. She thought about the 9th letter. Do not contact me again about this matter. My situation has changed. A situation that changed in 1988 that prevented someone from continuing a correspondence about legally complicated art holdings in a rural Oregon depot. In 1988, she thought about what the world of art law and cultural property had looked like in 1988, and she thought about whether there were events in that period that might constitute an unfavorable climate of the kind the letter described. She knew enough from her years of museum visits and her reading to know that the late 1980s had seen significant shifts in cultural property law. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was 1990. There had been other movements in the years before it, tightening questions of provenance, raising the scrutiny applied to items with unclear histories. There had been cases. There had been institutions that had faced uncomfortable questions about how they had acquired things. If Alec had been professionally connected to any of that world, the unfavorable climate of 1988 would have been real and specific and enough to make a careful person stop writing letters about a room full of undisclosed collected objects in a locked depot. She was not going to solve this at a diner table in Carver. She was going to have to give what she had to someone with the expertise to evaluate it correctly, and that meant Thursday and Catherine Foss and the documentation she still needed to finish. She paid for the coffee and drove back. She spent the rest of that day in the room, photographing everything. She used her phone, moving methodically through the shelves, taking multiple images from multiple angles of each item, each labeled tube, each sealed crate, the shelving itself, the walls, the construction. She photographed the ledger page by page, every entry, including the 4 pages about the 4th crate and the pocket at the back and the 9 letters spread out carefully on the table, each one photographed individually on both sides. She uploaded everything to a cloud account she created with an email address that had no connection to her name, that she accessed through the cellular data on her phone rather than through any Wi-Fi network. She backed it up to a second account. She sent a copy, compressed, to Catherine's email with a message that said, "Preliminary documentation. This is incomplete, but will give you a sense of what we're dealing with before Thursday." She did not know what Catherine would make of it. She knew that what she sent would be enough to make Thursday's meeting necessary. She was closing out the upload when she heard, from above her, the sound of a vehicle on the service road. She turned off her phone screen and stood very still in the dark. She listened. The sound was not Gerald's truck. It was something smaller and higher-pitched, idling. It stopped. She heard a car door, footsteps on the gravel, then silence. She stood at the bottom of the stairs in the sealed room and waited. The footsteps had stopped near the east wall, near the side door. She heard the door handle move. The door held. A pause. Then footsteps moving along the building's exterior, the same assessment walk Gerald had done, but slower, more deliberate, with stops that were longer. She did not move. The footsteps stopped. She heard a sound she recognized after a moment as the click of a camera shutter, not a phone, something with more mechanism behind it. Someone was photographing the exterior with a proper camera. Someone who had come prepared. Then the footsteps moved back toward the vehicle. She heard the car door. The engine turned over. The vehicle drove away. She stood in the dark for a long time after the sound faded. Gerald had come once and photographed the exterior with his phone. That she had understood as the behavior of a man checking on an asset he thought he had standing over. This was different. This was someone else. Someone who had come with a camera, who had moved around the building's exterior in a way that was more systematic than curious, who had left without trying to make contact. She did not know who it was. She did not know whether it was connected to Gerald, to the letters, to Alec, to any of the things she had found, or to something else entirely that she had not yet considered. She did know that the building had now been visited twice in 2 days by people who were paying attention to it in ways that it had not been paid attention to in many years, possibly decades. She climbed the stairs. She sealed the panel. She went to the east window and looked out at the service road in the dark. Empty. She stood there for a long time, watching the road, thinking about the camera shutter and the deliberate footsteps and the particular kind of patience required to come to a place, photograph it carefully, and leave without announcing yourself. Thursday was 1 day away. Catherine Foss was on her way. The documentation was uploaded and backed up. She needed to be ready for whatever Thursday brought, and she needed to be ready for the possibility that Thursday might arrive ahead of schedule. She went back to the bench in the waiting room and sat down and looked at the empty frames on the wall and thought about her grandfather, who had spent 41 years being patient about something very large while the world around him was entirely unaware that there was anything to be patient about. He had managed it. He had kept everything intact and documented and sealed. He had died in 1988 knowing the room was there and knowing she would eventually find it and knowing, she now believed, that she would know what to do with it even if it took her a while to get there. She was getting there. The camera outside had been pointed at the building. Whatever the person holding it had seen was the exterior of an old, derelict depot that the county had assessed at $4,800. They had seen crumbling trim and dirty windows and a locked door that did not give when you tried the handle. They had not seen anything else, because there was nothing else to see from outside. The room was below the floor. The panel was sealed. The ledger was on the table where her grandfather had left it, and the letters were in the pocket at the back of the ledger, and 76 items were wrapped and stored with the care of someone who had understood that they would need to wait. Her grandfather had made the room as invisible as the value of the building itself, which was to say he had made it nearly perfect, because the best place to hide something had always been somewhere no one thought to. Look, she was going to keep it that way until Thursday. She spent the last hour before sleep going over everything she had prepared. The photographs were uploaded. The notes were as complete as she could make them without the expertise that Catherine would bring. The ledger entries she had transcribed to her legal pad in her own handwriting were careful and accurate. She had made her best effort at the timeline of each item's arrival and documentation. She had flagged the entries that raised the question the ninth letter had identified as the most important one, the items whose insurance histories she had not been able to determine, the ones for which a record of declared loss and resolved settlement might exist somewhere in an archive she had not yet reached. She was not going to be able to answer all of these questions herself. She had known that from the beginning, which was why she had called Catherine and why Thursday mattered. The questions that remained were the kind that required expertise she did not have, access to archives she could not reach on her own, and the specific knowledge of how legal claims were established and defended in situations that had no clean precedent. But she had given herself the best starting position available to her, which was the position her grandfather had designed the room to give her. Complete documentation, full inventory, the ledger, the letters, the photographs, everything recorded, everything preserved, everything left in the condition of someone who had understood that the people who came after them would need to know exactly what they were working with. She thought, before she closed her eyes, about the first entry in the ledger. 1947. Her grandfather had been in his early 30s then, a young stationmaster in a small town, careful and precise, and already beginning to make decisions about things that passed through his hands that no one else was watching. He had spent the next 4 decades building something that he had never told anyone about, and had never used for himself, and had never once, as far as she could determine from the ledger or the letters, considered selling or converting to any personal advantage. He had kept it. He had protected it. He had trusted her with it. She was going to be worthy of that trust. She was going to be as careful as he had been and as patient as the situation required and as steady as the building itself, which had been standing for over a century and was not done standing yet. She closed her eyes. One day until Thursday. Thursday arrived the way consequential days often do, without any outward indication that it was different from the one before it. The sky was the same pale gray it had been all week. The fields on either side of the service road held the same frozen silence. The depot stood as it had always stood, its painted boards and dirty windows giving nothing away to anyone who drove past without reason to stop. Nora was up before the light. She had not slept well and had not expected to. She had spent the night on the bench with the blankets pulled around her, drifting in and out of a half-sleep that kept returning her to the same half-formed thoughts. The camera shutter she had heard 2 days ago, the 9 letters from Alec, the 4th crate, and its 11 sealed tubes. She rose in the dark and folded the blankets and went out to the car to change into the clean clothes she had kept in her bag for a day. She needed to look like herself rather than like someone who had been sleeping in a building for 3 nights. She drove to Carver for coffee and drove back. She arrived at the depot at 8:15 and parked and went inside and spent an hour going through her notes one final time, reading everything she had written, correcting 2 transcription errors she found in her ledger entries, adding a notation she had forgotten to include about the 9th letter's date. She worked the way her grandfather had apparently worked, methodically and without hurrying, because hurrying produced the kind of mistakes that mattered. Catherine Foss arrived at 10:40. She drove a practical sedan with Oregon plates and got out carrying a leather bag that was the bag of someone who had come to work. She was perhaps 50, shorter than Nora expected from a phone call that had projected a particular kind of confidence, with dark hair going gray at the temples and the specific alertness in her eyes of someone who had spent decades in rooms where details mattered and had learned to register them automatically. She looked at the depot's exterior for a moment before she looked at Nora. Then she looked at Nora. "You've been staying here," she said. "Not a question." 3 nights, Nora said. Catherine absorbed this without comment. She looked back at the building. "The assessment value is what you told me. $4,800. Catherine nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing a data point. "Show me." Nora took her through the building in order, starting with the freight room and the waiting room, giving her the history as they moved through the space. The dates, the railroad, her grandfather's role, the transfer of the deed. Catherine listened without interrupting, her eyes moving over everything: the shelving, the counter, the high windows, the wide plank floor. She crouched once to look at the floor's construction, the way the boards were laid, and straightened without speaking. When they reached the shelving unit on the freight room's inner wall, Nora stopped. "This is where it starts," she said. She pressed the lever. She heard the latch release. She pulled the panel open. The smell came through the opening the way it had the first time, dry and old and specific in the way of things that have been carefully kept. Catherine stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, looking down. "Your grandfather built this," she said. "Yes. Alone. As far as I can tell. There are 9 letters in the ledger that suggest he corresponded with someone who knew the room existed. But the construction, the shelving, everything physical, that was him." Catherine started down the stairs. She stood at the bottom for a long time without speaking. Nora stood beside her with the flashlight, letting the beam move slowly around the room, watching Catherine's face. The professional neutrality held for perhaps 30 seconds. Then something shifted in it, something that was not surprise exactly, but was the expression of someone whose understanding of a situation has just expanded beyond what they had prepared for. "Tell me about the ledger," Catherine said. They spent 2 hours at the table. Nora walked Catherine through every section of the ledger, the entry structure, the documentation methodology, the provenance notations, the estimated values. Catherine read carefully, occasionally asking Nora to go back to a specific entry, occasionally making notes in a small notebook she had taken from her bag. She did not rush. She did not perform any emotion that Nora could read as disproportionate to what she was actually seeing. She was doing her job, which was to understand what she was looking at before she said anything about it. She asked about the construction of the room. Nora explained what she had been able to determine from looking at it: the concrete walls, the beams, the shelving, the narrow windows set flush with the depot floor above. Catherine listened and made notes. She asked about the condition of the items on the shelves, whether Nora had opened anything beyond what she had described in the preliminary photographs. Nora told her exactly what she had opened and in what order, and what she had found, and how she had handled each item. She told her about replacing the lid on the 4th crate without opening the tubes. Catherine noted this with an approval that was not effusive but was real. She asked about the number of nights Nora had slept in the building before calling her. 3. She asked whether Nora had told anyone else about the room. No one. She asked whether anyone had seen Nora accessing the building during those 3 days. She described Gerald's visit and the second visitor with the camera. Catherine's expression tightened slightly at the second visitor. She wrote something in her notebook that Nora could not read from across the table. When they reached the entry for the fourth crate, Catherine read the 4 pages twice. Then she looked up. He identified the attributions himself? Through library research and correspondence, Nora said. He documented his methodology in a separate notation attached to each entry. He cross-referenced museum catalogs and academic publications. He was systematic about it. A stationmaster in rural Oregon, Catherine said, not dismissively. More like someone working through a calculation that kept producing an unexpected result. He read, Nora said. He had time and he used it. Catherine returned to the ledger. When she had finished the 4 pages, she sat back and looked at the 4th crate against the south wall. You haven't opened the tubes. No. Good. She made a note. That was the right call. She looked at the other crates, at the shelves, at the wrapped and stored objects that lined every wall. Okay, she said, and the word carried a particular weight that told Nora she had made her assessment. I need to make some calls. She made the calls from the freight room above, where the phone signal was marginally stronger. Nora sat on the bench in the waiting room and listened to the murmur of Catherine's voice without being able to make out the words, and thought about her grandfather sitting in the same building, in the same quiet, for 41 years with everything he knew kept below his feet. Catherine came back after 20 minutes. I've spoken with 2 people, she said. One is a colleague who specializes in art law and cultural property. She practices in Seattle. Her name is Diane Holt. I've worked with her before, and she is the right person for the provenance questions. The second is someone in the Pacific Northwest arts community who has institutional connections that will be useful when the time comes for authentication. She paused. Both of them want to come here as soon as possible. I told them Saturday. Is that workable? Yes, Nora said. Good. Catherine sat down across from her on the adjacent bench. I want to tell you what I think, and I want to be careful about it, because I am not an expert in art law and my view is preliminary. Nora nodded. Your grandfather was meticulous. Whatever decisions he made about the items in that room, he documented with a rigor that most institutions don't apply to their own collections. The ledger is extraordinary. The condition of the items, from what I can see without opening anything, appears to be good. The structure he built is sound. The conservation materials he used were appropriate for the period. Catherine set her notebook on her knee. The legal questions are real, and some of them are complicated. Diane will be better positioned to evaluate the specific provenance issues than I am. But my preliminary view is that what your grandfather created down there is not easily characterized as simple theft or conversion. He followed documented procedure and then exercised a discretion that the procedure did not clearly prohibit, and he kept a record that demonstrates he understood the weight of what he was doing. She paused. Again, that matters. Nora waited. The 9 letters matter, too, Catherine said. They show he sought external perspective on the legal and ethical dimensions. He was not acting in ignorance or in bad faith. He was acting in the absence of clear guidance, and he kept a record of that absence. There's a meaningful difference. Nora had understood this intellectually since the night she had read the letters. Hearing it from a lawyer who had just spent 2 hours with the documentation made it settle differently in her chest. What happened Saturday? She asked. Diane looks at everything. Depending on what she finds, we begin the process of establishing your claim as your grandfather's heir to his estate, which includes this property and its contents. We identify which items have the most straightforward path to clear title, and we start there. The complicated ones take longer. Catherine looked at her steadily. This is going to be a long process, Nora. Months, possibly more than a year for full resolution. I want you to be prepared for that. I'm not going anywhere, Nora said. Catherine almost smiled. The next thing that happened was Gerald. He arrived at 11:15 the following morning, a Friday, with a man Nora did not recognize who carried himself with the specific manner of someone accustomed to assessing property in a professional capacity. A real estate appraiser, she thought, or someone functioning in that role. Gerald's truck was followed by a second vehicle, a white sedan that parked beside it on the service road. Nora watched them from the freight room window. She had already called Catherine, who had told her to stay calm. to let them approach, and to say nothing about the room or its contents. Gerald knocked on the side door. He knocked twice, and when Nora opened it, his expression cycled through surprise, and then something she read as calculated adjustment, the expression of a man who had expected to find an empty building and was recalibrating. "Nora," he said. "Gerald, you're still here." He looked past her into the freight room, taking in the blankets on the bench, the bag on the counter, the flashlight beside it. "You've been staying here. It's my building." The man behind Gerald introduced himself as a property assessor from a firm in the county seat. He had a clipboard and a certain professional blankness of expression. Gerald, Nora understood, had hired him to establish the building's value for purposes she could guess at. "I'd like to have the building assessed," Gerald said, with the particular smoothness of someone who believes they hold more leverage than they do. "For your benefit, actually. If you're thinking about selling, you should know what it's worth. I'd be willing to discuss a purchase." Nora looked at him for a moment. 6 months ago, she would have felt the familiar tightening in her chest that Gerald's specific brand of presumption always produced. She did not feel it now. She felt something that was closer to the steadiness her grandfather must have felt, year after year, when the world moved past the depot and failed to understand what it was walking over. "The building is not for sale," she said. Gerald's expression shifted again. "Nora, this building has been assessed at less than $5,000. It's deteriorating. The land alone might have some value if it were cleared, and I could help you get a better return than you'd get on your own." "I appreciate the offer," she said. "The answer is no." The assessor shifted on his feet. Gerald looked at her with the look she had been on the receiving end of for 8 years, the look that said he knew better than she did what was reasonable. "I'm going to need to ask you both to leave," Nora said. "This is private property, and I haven't invited either of you inside." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "You can't stay here indefinitely. You have an apartment in Carver." "I'm aware of my own address. This isn't a residence, Nora. There's no power, no running water. The county could, Gerald." She said his name the way her grandfather had apparently said difficult things, without heat, without apology, with the particular quietness that is the opposite of backing down. "I need you to leave now. If you have anything further to say about this property, you can direct it to my attorney." He did not move immediately. He stood in the doorway the way people stand when they are deciding whether the conversation they wanted to have is still available to them. And then he decided it was not, and he stepped back. "Your attorney," he said, with the tone of someone who has just been told something they find faintly amusing. "Catherine Foss," Nora said. "Portland. I'll give you her number." She gave it to him. He took it. He and the assessor walked back to the truck. They sat in it for perhaps 5 minutes, and then both vehicles drove away. Nora stood in the freight room and breathed, and then called Catherine and told her what had happened. Catherine said she had expected something like this, and that her firm would send a letter to Gerald within the week establishing clearly that the property had no relationship to the Hale estate, and that any further attempts to access or assess it without permission would be treated accordingly. She also said that given the timeline of events, it would be advisable to move up the documentation process. Saturday arrived with a quality of attention that Nora had not felt from a day in a long time. Diane Holt was perhaps 45, dark-haired and precise, with the particular focus of someone whose expertise had been built through long practice and whose intelligence ran underneath everything she said rather than on the surface of it. She had brought, with Catherine's approval, 2 other people, a colleague from her firm who specialized in cultural property law, and a woman named Paula Renner, who was a conservator with 20 years of experience at institutions Nora recognized from museum visits with Marcus. They spent 6 hours in the room. Paula moved through the shelves with a care that made Nora feel, for the first time, that what she had been doing alone with a flashlight had been a reasonable approximation of what a professional would do, but only an approximation. The conservator handled nothing without gloves. She photographed everything with professional equipment, a camera body that was larger and more deliberate than anything Nora had used, with a portable lighting setup she assembled at the base of the stairs that changed the character of the room entirely, making visible details in the wrapping and in the construction that Nora had missed in flashlight. She made notations in a language that was partly technical and partly its own shorthand, and she consulted with Diane periodically in low voices that Nora did not try to overhear. Paula examined the condition of the wrapped pieces with a thoroughness that Nora found both reassuring and humbling. She checked the seams of the conservation wrapping on each piece she could examine without opening, pressing gently at the edges, looking for any sign of moisture intrusion or material failure. She tested the air in the room with a small instrument she had brought in her bag. She measured the temperature. She checked the concrete walls for any sign of seepage or crack propagation. When she had worked through the shelves, she turned to the crates and examined them in the same methodical way, checking the wax seals, testing the joinery, assessing what she could assess without opening them. At one point she stopped and stood in the middle of the room and simply looked at it, the way you look at something you have not finished understanding yet. Nora watched her from near the stairs. "Your grandfather was not trained in conservation," Paula said. It was not a question. "Not formally," Nora said. "He read." Paula nodded. "He read the right things." She looked back at the shelves. "This room has maintained a more stable microclimate than most storage facilities I've worked in. That's partly the construction and partly the original ceiling, but it's also partly luck, and I think he knew it was luck and accounted for it by being more careful than he strictly had to be. The wrapping materials he chose, for the period, are not what I would have specified, but they are not wrong. And he did not underdress or overdress anything. He made conservative choices across the board." Nora thought about her grandfather's ledger entries, about the specific and non-inflated quality of the estimates he had written beside each item. Conservative choices across the board. That was, she thought, a reasonable summary of the man. Diane read the ledger the way a lawyer reads a document, slowly and entirely, not skimming anything. She read the 4 pages about the 4th crate and read them again. She found the pocket at the back of the ledger without being told to look for it, because she was the kind of person who checked the back of a document before she decided she had finished reading it. She read all 9 letters in sequence and then read the last 3 again. In the late afternoon, they gathered at the table. "The provenance questions are significant," Diane said. "I won't minimize that. Several of the items will require extensive research to establish clear title, and some of that research will depend on archives that are not easily accessible. The items in the 4th crate are the most complicated because their value makes the provenance question carry more weight." She set her notebook on the table. "That said," she continued, "the documentation your grandfather produced is more thorough than what I've seen in many formal institutional acquisition records. His methodology is clear, his records of notification attempts are complete, and his estimated value assessments are, from what I can evaluate without a formal appraisal, conservative rather than inflated, which actually helps your position because it suggests he was not rationalizing. He was recording." She paused. "The 9 letters are going to be important. They demonstrate that he sought external legal and ethical perspective on what he was doing. That's significant." Paula Renner spoke next. "The conservation condition is remarkable. Whatever materials he sourced and however he learned to apply them, the result is that most of what's in this room is in substantially better condition than it would be if it had remained in ordinary transit or institutional storage conditions. 60-plus years in a sealed, climate-stable concrete room with appropriate wrapping. That's not how most freight ends up." "What comes next?" Nora asked. "A formal appraisal," Diane said. "We bring in a team with the specific expertise to evaluate each item properly. That process will take time and will require opening the crates and the tubes under controlled conditions with proper documentation. We do it here initially, then move what needs to move to appropriate facilities." She looked at Nora across the table. "Before any of that, I want to research the correspondent your grandfather called Alec. The 9 letters are unsigned, but the handwriting, the specific knowledge demonstrated in the letters, the period, these are identifiable characteristics. I have a colleague who may be able to help narrow it down." Nora had been thinking about Alec since the night she had found the letters. Hearing it named as an actionable research question was something she found unexpectedly steadying. "How long?" she asked. "For Alec? Days, maybe. For the full appraisal and initial legal work? Months." Diane looked at her steadily. "But we start Monday." They started Monday. The 2 weeks that followed were the most concentrated period of focused work Nora had experienced since the early years of her planning office career, when she had been young enough to find sustained effort energizing rather than depleting. Catherine and Diane had established a working group. Paula Renner returned twice with a colleague from a Portland institution. A formal appraiser was brought in, a specialist in works of the period and type represented in the collection, who spent 3 days in the room with equipment and a careful deliberateness that matched what Nora had read of her grandfather's own approach. The tubes in the fourth crate were opened on the fourth day, under Paula Renner's supervision, with 3 people present who had the specific expertise to handle what came out of them correctly. Nora stood against the far wall and watched and said nothing. The conservator worked with the patience of someone who understood that the thing in her hands had been waiting 53 years and could wait another minute more if that minute was used carefully. The works that came out of the tubes were small to medium in format, rolled on archival cores, their surfaces in a condition that made Paula Renner go quiet in a particular way that Nora had come to understand meant something significant. She worked through each of the 11 in sequence, unrolling each just enough to allow examination, making notations, photographing, re-rolling with the same unhurried precision. When she reached the 7th work, she stopped. She was still for a moment. Then she looked at the appraiser across the table. The appraiser looked back at her. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Nora stood against the wall and watched. The preliminary appraisal results came back on a Wednesday afternoon, 19 days after Catherine had first walked through the side door of the depot. Diane called Nora into a small meeting she had set up in a conference room at a law office in Carver, which had become their operational base in the absence of anywhere else appropriate. Catherine was there. The appraiser, whose name was Richard Chung, was there by phone. Richard Chung walked them through the preliminary figures in the methodical way of someone who had given difficult news and extraordinary news and had learned to deliver both in the same register, because the register mattered. The items on the shelves, the wrapped paintings and small bronzes and currency collection and architectural drawings, ranged in current estimated value from the modest to the significant. Several of the paintings were works whose attributions, once confirmed, would carry substantial market value. The currency collection, properly evaluated by a specialist Richard had consulted, was in a category that made the numbers memorable. The items in the 4th crate were different. Richard took his time with them. He described the 7 probable attributions and the process by which they had been assessed, the technical analysis that had been conducted, the comparisons with documented works in institutional collections, the opinion of 2 additional specialists he had consulted in confidence. He described what the 7th item had turned out to be, the one that had made Paula Renner go quiet, and what its current estimated value was, and what the range of that estimate was depending on provenance resolution. Nora sat across the table from Catherine and listened to these numbers and did not say anything for a moment after Richard finished speaking. Then she said, "What is the total preliminary figure?" Richard gave it to her. She had written a number on the bottom of her legal pad 19 days ago using a rough calculation that she had known was approximate and that she had not let herself look at directly since. The number Richard gave her was larger than that number. She looked at Catherine, who looked back at her with an expression that was neither congratulatory nor dramatic. It was the expression of someone who had understood for several days that this conversation was coming and had decided that the right response to it was steadiness, because steadiness was what the situation required. "The provenance resolution affects the final figure significantly," Richard said over the phone. "Some of the more complicated items may result in negotiated outcomes that reduce the net figure. The items with resolved insurance settlements are the ones that carry the most legal risk, and depending on how those questions resolve, the outcome could vary by a meaningful margin. But my preliminary view is that the collection's value, across its full scope, falls within a range that begins at a figure I am comfortable characterizing as substantial by any measure." The range he named began at $62 million and extended, with favorable provenance resolution on the 7th item from the 4th crate, to $94 million. Nora sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "What did my grandfather write in his estimate for that item? In the ledger?" Catherine opened the ledger copy she had made. She found the entry. She read the estimated value her grandfather had written in his careful hand in 1971, adjusted in a later notation in 1979 when he had apparently done further research. The figure he had written, in $1979, was a number that suggested James Calloway had understood, with remarkable accuracy, what he was keeping. They had known. He had known. Diane identified Alec on a Thursday, using the methodology she had described and a colleague who worked in the history of Pacific Northwest art law. The correspondent in the 9 letters had been a man named Alexander Moorfield, a Providence researcher and informal legal consultant who had worked independently in Portland and Seattle through the 1970s and 1980s. He had died in 1992. His professional reputation, reconstructed from the papers of the period, was that of someone who had thought carefully about difficult questions in cultural property law before the field had developed the frameworks it now operated by, and who had sometimes reached conclusions that institutions found uncomfortable. He had known James Calloway, evidently, since before 1979. The nature of their initial connection was not entirely clear from the available record, but Diane's colleagues suspected they had met through the railroad's freight claims system, which had occasionally required the kind of Providence consultation that someone in Moorfield's position could provide informally. They had maintained a correspondence that lasted nearly a decade and had ended abruptly, as the 9th letter indicated, when Moorfield's circumstances changed in 1988. What changed in 1988 was that Moorfield had been approached by a federal investigator in connection with an unrelated art matter and had, out of caution, stepped back from anything that could be characterized as involvement in the undisclosed custody of unresolved freight items. He had written the 9th letter 6 months before James Calloway died. Her grandfather had kept all 9 of them in the back of his ledger for the remaining 6 months of his life and had left them there when he was gone. Nora learned this from Diane on the same Thursday that the formal legal process for establishing her claim was initiated. She sat in the conference room in Carver and thought about 2 men in the 1970s and 1980s, one a rural stationmaster and one a legal consultant, corresponding carefully about a room full of things that the world had forgotten, and about how both of them had ultimately kept that confidence until one of them could not and the other was gone. She thought about the 9th letter. Do not contact me again about this matter. My situation has changed. She thought about how her grandfather had received that letter, whether he had understood what it meant for his own timeline, whether he had felt the urgency of time beginning to close, whether he had thought about her specifically in the 6 months between the 9th letter and his death, whether he had added anything to the room in those months or had simply gone on documenting what was already there, making sure the record was as complete as he could make it, trusting that she would find it. She thought he had trusted her. She believed that fully. The legal process that followed was long and not simple, and Catherine had been right to prepare her for it. There were months of correspondence with institutions and with the successors of the insurance companies that had processed the relevant claims. There were negotiations that Diane described, with professional understatement, as productive but sustained. There were 2 items whose provenance questions required outcomes that Nora accepted without difficulty. Those items were returned to the institutions that could establish the clearest claim, transferred with the full documentation her grandfather had maintained, in condition that the receiving institutions described in terms that made the conservators at Nora's table sit a little straighter. There were items that passed through a legal process that Diane navigated with the competence of someone who had prepared carefully for exactly this kind of argument and had the documentation to back every position she took. There were items that reached resolution in Nora's favor because 60 years had passed and the railroad had been absorbed twice, and the records that would have been needed to argue otherwise had been subject to 3 different retention policies and had not survived all of them. Gerald's letter arrived in the 6th month. It was not from Gerald. It was from Gerald's attorney, who had been doing his own research into the depot property and had reached the conclusion, which the letter conveyed in the careful language of someone correcting a strategic misreading, that the Hale estate had no claim on the property and that his client would not be pursuing the matter further. Catherine forwarded it to Nora with a brief note that said only, as expected. Nora read it once and filed it and did not think about it at great length, because Gerald Hale had never been the point. He had been a circumstance, the kind of circumstance that shapes the conditions under which something happens without determining what the thing is. What her grandfather had built in the room below the depot had nothing to do with Gerald, and what she was going to do with it had even less. Patricia called her in the 9th month. It was an unexpected call, a number Nora almost did not answer. When she did answer it, Patricia said almost nothing for a moment. Then she said that she had heard about the building, that everyone in Millhaven had heard about it by then, that a story like this did not stay quiet in a town of 6,000 people regardless of how carefully anyone tried to manage it. Nora waited. I don't know what I expected to say, Patricia said. Her voice was different from the voice Nora had associated with her for 8 years. It was smaller, not apologetic exactly, more like a voice that had lost the particular confidence that comes from believing you understand how things work and had not yet found a replacement for it. "It's all right," Nora said. "Is it?" She thought about that. "I'm not sure," she said honestly, "but I'm not interested in being otherwise." Patricia was quiet again. Then she said that Marcus had liked the depot, that he had mentioned it sometimes, had said once that Nora had a good inheritance in it, even if she couldn't see it yet, that he thought there was something there worth paying attention to. Nora sat with that for a moment. "He was right," she said. "The final appraised value of the collection, after provenance resolution, after the negotiated returns of the items that were returned, after all of the costs, and the legal work, and the conservation expenses, and the process that had taken 14 months from the night Nora had pressed a small metal lever on the underside of a shelf, came to a figure that Diane presented to her in a document that ran to 11 pages of supporting material. It was not $94 million. The negotiations and the returns had reduced it from the high end of Richard Chung's preliminary range. It was also not $62 million. The favorable resolution on the 7th item from the 4th crate, which had turned out to have a provenance history that supported rather than complicated the assessment, had moved the final number above the low end of the range. It was, Diane told her with the specific plainness of a lawyer presenting information to a client, a figure in the low 80s. Nora sat across from Diane in the conference room in Carver and thought about her grandfather, who had written his estimates in a ledger in a room below a building the county had assessed at $4,800 and had gotten it right. She sat for a while. Outside the conference room window, the town of Carver went about its ordinary business. A woman crossed the street with a bag of groceries. A truck pulled out of the hardware store parking lot. The ordinary things that the world did while other things were being decided in rooms slightly apart from it. She thought about the night she had pressed the lever. The sound of the latch releasing, the inch of darkness appearing at the panel's edge, the smell that came through it, which she had recognized without being able to name. She thought about standing at the top of the stairs for a long time before she put her foot on the first step, and about what it had meant to put her foot on the first step, and about all the days between that moment and this one. She thought about the granola bar she had eaten standing at the counter on the morning she had first gone down the stairs. The way the bench had felt under her after a night of half-sleep. The flashlight beam moving slowly around the room, catching the edge of a wrapped piece here and the corner of a crate there, and the understanding that had arrived in pieces, each piece larger than the last. Then she said, "What do I do now?" Diane had prepared for this question in the way she prepared for everything. She walked Nora through the options, practical and considered, without telling her what to decide. There were tax considerations. There were estate planning questions. There were decisions to make about the depot itself, about what it should become now that its hidden character had been established and its concealment was no longer necessary. Nora made those decisions over the months that followed, not quickly, because her grandfather had not been a quick man and she had learned something from that. She paid the debt she owed on the studio apartment she had never lived in and apologized to the landlord in Carver for the disruption. She found a proper place to live in Mill Haven, a house on a quiet street that she bought without asking anyone's opinion about whether it was right for her. She established a fund in her grandfather's name at the County Historical Society, which documented the history of the Mill Haven Depot among its records, and which now had something more than a rusted loading dock to show for it. She restored the depot, not to operational condition, which was not possible, but to structural soundness, because it had stood for over a century and her grandfather had trusted her with it, and she was not going to let it fall down on her watch. The freight room got its roof repaired. The waiting room got its windows cleaned, and the afternoon light that came through them, properly, for the first time in years was different in quality from what she had seen through the grime, warmer and more specific, light that had a character. The wide plank floors were treated and preserved by someone who knew how to do it without changing what they were, which was old and worn and marked with 41 years of a stationmaster's work. The loading dock was stabilized, the rusted metal cleared, the gravel of the service road smoothed. The painted boards that had concealed the narrow windows below the freight room floor were left in place, because they were original and because the room below remained sealed and because some things are allowed to keep their character. She had the 3 empty frames in the waiting room rehung with appropriate glass, and asked the County Historical Society whether they had any photographs of what might once have been in them. They had one, found in a collection of railroad documentation, a photograph from 1951 showing the waiting room's interior with the frames occupied by timetables and a railroad map of the region. She had reproductions made from the photograph and placed them in 2 of the 3 frames, which was all the photograph clearly showed. The 3rd frame she left empty, because she did not know what had been in it, and she was not going to guess. The timetable from 1961 she left where it was. It belonged there. She had left the ledger on the table. She had left the lamp her grandfather must have used, a small kerosene lantern still sitting in the corner near the south wall, which she had not noticed on her first visits and which Paula Renner had identified as appropriate to the 1950s. She left all of it where it was, because it was his and it was also hers, and there was no version of keeping faith with either of those things that involved changing it. What she kept of the collection, what remained in her possession after the returns and the negotiations and the settlements, she placed initially in proper storage while she thought about what to do with it. In time she made decisions that felt like the right decisions, which was the only measure she had ever trusted for that kind of question. Several pieces went to institutions where they would be seen. Several remained with her. 1. The painting from the first crate she had opened, the one with the woman's face in 3/4 profile, and the brushwork that had made her stand still for a long time in the beam of a flashlight. She kept in the house on the quiet street in Millhaven, where she could see it from the chair she read in on winter evenings. She thought about her grandfather often. She thought about him when she looked at the painting, and when she walked the freight room of the restored depot, and when she turned the key in the side door that still had the original lock, the lock that had resisted her the night she had come to it in the cold with nowhere else to go. She thought about what he had done and why he had done it, and what it had cost him to keep it for 4 decades without telling anyone. She thought about the particular kind of faith it took to trust someone with something that large, to leave a letter and a key in a room and believe that the person you had left it for would find their way to it eventually. She thought about whether he had been confident in her or merely hopeful, and she decided the distinction did not matter as much as the act of trusting, which had been the thing itself. She had found it. She had protected it. She had done what needed to be done with it, carefully and without rushing, the way he had done everything. She was still in Millhaven. She had not left the town after all, which was not what she had planned the night she drove away from the Hale property in the cold with 2 deputies watching her go. But plans were the maps you drew before you knew what the terrain actually looked like, and the terrain had turned out to be different from anything she had mapped. Her grandfather had known this. He had probably known it about his own life, the way quiet people know things about the nature of things without needing to announce that they know them. She sat one evening in the waiting room of the restored depot, in the last of the winter light coming through the cleansed windows, on the old bench that was still there, still bolted to the floor, worn smooth by decades of people who had waited here for something to arrive. She had a cup of coffee and her legal pad, which was old now and almost full, and she wrote in it the things she wanted to remember about the past 14 months. Not the numbers. The numbers were in documents that other people kept. What she wrote were the things that the documents did not contain. The smell of the room the first time the panel opened. The weight of the bronze in her hands. Her grandfather's handwriting. The forward slant of his letters. The way he made his 7s with a horizontal bar. The particular quality of the moonlight that had come through the freight room windows on the first night. Pale and diffuse through 40 years of grime. Enough to show her the outlines of the space. The sound of the latch releasing when she pressed the lever. She wrote about her grandfather's ledger entries, about the precision of them and the humility of them, about the way he had never inflated a figure or embellished a description or made himself the hero of any notation. He had recorded what he had done and why, and had done so with the matter-of-fact steadiness of someone who believed the record itself was the point, not the impression the record made. She wrote about the 9th letter, about what it must have meant to receive it, about the 6 months between that letter and her grandfather's death, which she had spent some time thinking about over the previous 14 months, and which she had reached a private conclusion about. She believed he had known, after the 9th letter, that the time available to him was not what he had expected. She believed he had used those 6 months to make sure the record was as complete as possible. She believed the letter he had left for her had been written during those 6 months, not earlier, because the specific instruction it contained, to look carefully at everything before letting anyone else in, was the instruction of a man who had recently received a reminder that he would not always be there to give it in person. She wrote about the bench she was sitting on, about the people who had sat on it before her, the people who had waited in this room for trains that would carry them somewhere, or bring someone to them, or mark the beginning or the end of something. The ordinary, remarkable movements of ordinary lives that a train station accumulated over 75 years of operation. She thought about what her grandfather had seen from this room, the daily presence of all of that, and about whether it had shaped him or simply confirmed something he had already known, which was that things passed through and things were left behind, and the question was always what you did with what remained. The depot was quiet around her. Outside, the fields were still frozen, the same gray they had been the night she had pulled onto the shoulder and seen the building's outline against the sky and made the decision to turn down the service road. The service road itself was better now, the worst of the ruts filled in, the gravel regrade. The loading dock was stable. The roof did not leak. The door opened when you turned the key rather than when you put your shoulder against it and pushed. Small improvements. The kind that did not announce themselves and did not need to. The kind that her grandfather would have recognized as the right approach, because the right approach to a thing was never to transform it into something it was not, but to help it become more fully what it already was. She thought that was probably the right way to think about what had happened to her, too. Not that she had been transformed by what she had found. She had not become a different person. She was still the person who had come to Millhaven for a job and stayed for a man and had spent 8 years learning to navigate a family that had never quite made room for her. She was still the person who had driven away from the Hale property in the cold with 2 deputies watching. She was still the person who had lain on a wooden bench in a building the county had assessed at $4,800 and listened to Oldwood settle and fallen asleep without meaning to. What had changed was not who she was. What had changed was what she was standing on. The ground beneath her had always held this. Her grandfather had put it there and had trusted her with the key and had left a letter she had understood too simply until the moment she was ready to understand it correctly, which turned out to be the exact moment she needed to. She finished the coffee and closed the legal pad and sat in the depot that was hers, in the town that she had not been intended for and had stayed in anyway, and listened to the buildings settle around her in the particular language of old structures at rest. It was the same sound she had heard on the first night, low and regular and entirely without threat. The sound of something that had been standing a very long time and knew exactly what it was and had no intention of becoming anything else. She sat with it for a while. Then she turned off the lamp and locked the door and drove home. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.